Well, hey everybody, welcome to this special edition of HITRUST Secrets. I'm Sue Richards here with Donna Dodson and Jeff McHugh, kind of our founder group of HITRUST Secrets. We started this just about a year ago, so we're coming up on our 1 year anniversary, and we're closing out 2025 with some you heard it here first type things from the CEO of HITRUST as well as Ryan Patrick, also from HITRUST. But very happy to welcome Gregory Webb, CEO of HITRUST.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here, guys.
Absolutely. So, wanted to kind of get started with, your background, your experience, kind of, get to know who is Gregory Webb, kind of, where you showed up with compliance and your journey here.
Absolutely. I will first acknowledge that I'm sitting at a busy, noisy airport. So I'm going to apologize to anyone on the bridge today who can't hear me perfectly well. I would say that the product that I'm using in my ears is pretty good at noise cancellation, not perfect. And I'll also apologize to people around me at the airport who might have to listen to this and don't know what's going on. But again, it's a pleasure to be here. I'd love to talk. I mean, I'd love to talk about my background. I'm not as comfortable talking about myself, but I certainly love what we do. I think we have to acknowledge that the world we live in is a pretty complicated place, and there are threats that come from lots of places. And I have professionally for a long time been in the cybersecurity space and care deeply for it. I think we have to acknowledge, and if I look back at my career, it's pretty obvious that you have lots of bad actors out there. There were times in there were times in our lives where the bad actors, you just build a good moat around your organization and you were probably okay. With the advent of things like cloud and multi-cloud and lots of SaaS solutions out there, I think the world has changed. That's one. Two, I would argue that in general, nation states are pretty serious actors. And what that means generally is that it's not uncommon for a nation state to invest heavily in some new attack vector, some technology, and it's not many years before that same attack vector is in the hands of common cyber criminals. We actually just had a spoofing incident yesterday where someone literally created an account using the .com version of my email address, gregory.webb at hitrustalliance.net, and used the .com version and sent it as though it was coming from me to my CFO asking for something to be approved. And this is, as we know, very common phishing kinds of attacks. I would just say that the work we do, and this is really just the preface to a little bit of the background, is I care deeply about what we do. We're protecting the world. HITRUST as a name might mean one thing. To me, it means that we are responsible to provide high trust, high levels of assurance in the space that we're in, both in assurance and in cyber in general. In terms of my background, I mean, I did not come at this normally. If you look at my LinkedIn profile, it's fairly obvious. I did my doctorate, my PhD at the University of California, UCLA, in comparative literature. I thought I was going to be a professor a few years. Now it's been many years ago. And I'm really grateful that a friend at a company that you probably all know of from years back called Novell took my then curriculum vitae, the kind of standard academic approach to positioning yourself as a professor or future professor, turned it into a really nice resume, walked it around to some colleagues at Novell, and these guys took a huge bet on me. I will share, kind of anecdotally, somewhat, embarrassingly, I got to that company and I could not, I understood maybe 30% of what was said. So much jargon, so many acronyms, so many products, brand new space for me. I started in the kind of identity access management space at the time. And frankly, it's been a great journey ever since. And it's probably slightly atypical from those early days at Novell. I stayed there a couple of years. I went to a small startup that you may have heard of called Venafi, a great company in the machine identity, now called the machine identity space, really doing PKI governance and management through automated systems. Then went to there 8 years, totally committed to that company and felt like I needed to leave to continue my growth journey personally and professionally. And so what I did was go to another cybersecurity startup, this one backed by Andreessen Horowitz, the big venture capital backed guys, called Bromium. It was a phenomenal company, great technology, slightly ahead of its time, that did endpoint security via application isolation. Our software actually sat right on the bare metal below the operating system, which was great. Lots of big government agencies, and we eventually sold that company after I took over as the CEO, my first time as a CEO. After a couple of years, we sold that company to HP, the hardware guys, the ink guys. And then I just went to a company that maybe is part of the story in terms of thinking that I would maybe spend some time with my better half. We all wish for that opportunity. I certainly had the finances to be able to do so. And it wasn't long thereafter that I got a call from one of the co-founders of a then newly formed private equity company growth equity company called Brighton Park Capital. And the co-founders they're just tremendous human beings. So it wasn't too many conversations later where I decided with my wife's good guidance, hey, I should step back in. Interestingly, Brighton Park was newly formed. By the way, one of the co-founders is a guy named Mike Gregoire. May have heard of him. He was the CEO of a couple of publicly traded companies, including CA Technologies, that he helped architect the sale to Broadcom, as we all know. Great set of products in our adjacent space in terms of cybersecurity and other things. And when Mike convinced me to join, I largely joined because he was such an incredible operator. I've worked with lots of very capable investors, but actually getting to work for, report to, and learn from a strong operator like Mike, it was just a great privilege. And I frankly learned so much. He made me do some things differently. If you spend time in the venture capital world, it's a little more laissez-faire. Throw lots of money and hope one thing of 50 stick. Growth equity capital is very rigorous. You have to have a clear market fit. So I was the first hired gun CEO of their first portfolio company investment. Ran that company until December of last year. We sold it. It was a great outcome for all involved, and the new owner's quite happy with it. I still sit on the board of that company. And then thought again I would take some time off. Wasn't long before my good friends at Brighton Park made another phone call. I couldn't say no because I like the guys so much, and they're great partners in general. And I kind of jumped back in the seat. So that's a little bit of background to how I got to HITRUST. Maybe if it's helpful, Susan, I could just talk about their investment thesis as an investor in HITRUST who believe deeply in our core mission, which is, of course, is to provide world-class assurance solutions, products to some of the world's largest companies, including many healthcare companies that we could name by name and probably have done in this forum in the past. Brighton Park, who I, of course, know now well after a couple of years working together, just believe strongly that we are, in many ways, the North Star of this space. We generally have a product or series of products, including the E1, I1, and R2, that are known as gold standard when it comes to assurance. And we take great pride in our ability to help mitigate risk, expose risk, and then take appropriate action based on the capabilities we have in terms of that assurance framework with the controls, very rigorous controls, as you all know, that extend out to our biggest customers and many of their downstream dependent vendors who frankly expose those organizations to a significant amount of risk in a third-party risk or supply chain risk management framework. Now I'll pause there and take any follow-up questions if this is helpful.
Yeah, and I think we've actually talked about how, venture capital companies and equity companies really should be looking more closely at compliance and the controls that are in place in some of these organizations, and that they should be some of our biggest champions when it comes to making sure you've got proper assessments, the rigor involved, and things like that. So yeah, it ties in very well. So, I mean, I guess with Novell, probably back when you were working in Novell, because I remember my first foray with Novell, I was my now husband was working for the people who do the Grammys, and they set up a Novell network at Radio City Music Hall to do the Grammys. And I, of course, being an IT person, was like, hey, let me see if I can get on. So I was able to log in with guest access or admin access as a guest because they hadn't changed any of their default passwords. So it was kind of my first hacking story. But back then in the 90s, we weren't thinking too much about security because you had to physically be there, and be given access, physically. So kind of, where was your first, oh, I'm no longer strictly technology, I'm now focused on the information security piece of it?
Yeah, I think, for me, the Novell journey was great. I have a lot of great colleagues who I've actually hired a couple of times over in some instances and who I have a lot of respect for. I think Novell was ahead of its time in lots of things. I remember just anecdotally meeting customers who were running NetWare versions that had been in existence for 20 years, untouched, almost no maintenance required. So it was clearly some great technology. I did not, to answer your question though, Susan, really understand that landscape, and probably until I got to Venafi, and maybe even not until I got to Bromium, where it became clear. I remember this famous now quote. It's almost 20 years old, from Mark Andreessen, one of the co-founders of Andreessen Horowitz, who said, I think really adeptly, that software will eat the world. I think that concept of what it means when the world is a different kind of world than it was in the past. Certainly, my now adult and growing up, some teenagers, high school age children, the world they live in is a very different world than the one I grew up in just a few years ago, where if you think about what happens when you connect things and the interconnectivity and the so-called flattening of the world, the flattening of the earth, where we built some at the U.S. government's expense, taxpayer expense, we built some pretty fat literal cables under the ocean to places in the world that I've worked with and care deeply for, including India, in order to so-called outsource labor and make it lower cost. I think the reality is the world is changing dynamically, and because of that internet connectivity, the threat landscape has changed dramatically. It also means that, to your point, when you're not all in the same space, when it's not all so-called on-prem, and it's highly distributed in multi-tenant environments, the threat landscape becomes much more dramatic and significant. And I'd also argue, interestingly, relative to HITRUST, I think the greatest exposure today comes from third-party risk. It's not talked about enough. I think our founder, Dan Nutkus, who I think is brilliant, I had dinner with him last night here in Frisco, said when I joined the company, or maybe actually even during the interview process, he said, look, Greg, I want to be clear, like TPRM, third-party risk management, may not be the sexiest topic. Okay. But when a CISO or an organization experiences a breach because of a vendor through a third-party framework, somebody's going to lose their job. So we got to lean in on this and start thinking perhaps more seriously, which I think is what you're implying is, GRC frameworks, maybe not, pardon the profane, but, they're maybe not sexy. They don't have as much of that appeal as other functions in the, let's call it cybersecurity or even identity and access management. But I do think if we don't take it seriously, which we do, I think the risk exposure is pretty high. And our job, of course, is not to remediate that risk, is to expose where the risk is through those control frameworks. Right. And, members of the team who we just had an all hands company meeting in the office. There's a lot of vigor, passion, and commitment to customers, right? To making those organizations successful and prevent the kinds of attacks that we all know can take you off the grid and frankly, devalue shareholder, et cetera. So we've got a serious job to do, and we're pretty committed about it, and looking forward to the growth journey that we're on now with a new partner in Brighton Park.
I think you hit on a really interesting topic with third-party risk, because one of the flip sides of that is the incredible administrative burden that goes with it, which isn't actually driving better security. And you probably know I'm talking about the questionnaires.
Yes.
It's a long-standing problem, and it's incredibly frustrating, not only for organizations that have gone through HITRUST and they have HITRUST and they're going, right, well, why are you asking me 45 questions about, do you have this policy? Can I see this policy when I have HITRUST? I've gone through this. I'm not going to expose my internal policies and procedures because that's actually bad practice. So I want to show my HITRUST certification and have you look at that and value the work that we put into achieving this.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'll respond with a couple of things. One is I think there's such a thing as no practice or a non-practice, and I think too often that's the case. I think organizations, especially large organizations, we tend to focus on the global 5,000 organizations who are generally doing around $1 million or up in annual recurring revenue. And obviously, most of our customers are much bigger than that, more like Fortune 500 or Global 1,000 or Fortune 1,000. But I think if you think about the lens through which you look at this, you do have to acknowledge there are best practices. And we certainly acknowledge that in some cases, there's like these concentric overlapping circles between cybersecurity and risk management or compliance. And my fear is far too often it's a checkbox exercise. You're just trying to demonstrate compliance so you can check a box. We care much more passionately about what we do. So we think questionnaires are a worse practice. They just don't solve the problem. They don't expose the kind of risk. And I've got lots of views on lots of things. I also acknowledge that I'm new here. I come from a pure play cyber SaaS background, not an assurance background. So yeah. As Ryan can attest, in my 90 days, I just achieved my 90 days without even realizing. In the office last week in Frisco at the headquarters. It was a Thursday afternoon. I realized, my 90th day was the Tuesday prior, and I didn't realize I'm so busy. We're doing so many good things, but it does tell me in my Socratic onboarding journey, asking my direct reports and the founder and the board lots of questions to come up to speed. I don't think it changes my perspective, which is this is a serious issue, and then one that organizations, if they're not currently engaged and serious about it, need to get engaged. And I'll just say this last, and that Jeff, I think you had a comment, but one of the things that's become absolutely apparent to us is it's not the vendor in a third-party risk management framework who's responsible. to govern their own risk. It's the relying party. It's the organization whose business is dependent on downstream in-network vendors to, and you take your verbal choice here, right? Is it a mandate request, or is it a require prefer? I think you know where we feel like when it's a requirement from a third party to its vendor community, everything gets better in terms of the risk profile, especially for the maybe tier one vendors who clearly represent greater risk for lots of known reasons. Those are the conversations we're having with our largest customers who we care deeply for and try to provide good hygiene for, and obviously ongoing better technology offerings. But that's kind of my core view of that statement. Jeff, I'll pause, and I'd love your feedback on that as well.
Well, actually, I think you addressed parts of my question as it relates to third parties. You're talking about Fortune 500 companies or Fortune 1,000 companies, $1 million and up. Third parties being a risk, but to me, if we look at third parties, they could be very, very small that might not necessarily fit within HITRUST, but I find them to be great opportunities as well. So can you address third parties as an opportunity?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, that's why when I think about in the world of enterprise B2B business, we often speak about the ICP, right? The ideal customer profile.
Right.
We've identified that our ideal customer profile is not the vendor, because the vendors generally only take action when they're asked or mandated to do so, even though it might be a best practice. But the reality, Jeff, this might be what you're alluding to. We've actually found that we've kind of scratched the surface, pulled the threads on this. It turns out that most, if we just say Global 5,000, so the bigger companies, almost any one of those who considers itself a vendor in someone else's population, right, a relying party's population, most of them are also relying parties. They also have vendors in their networks. And I wouldn't say there's any value from our perspective of quantifying the size, either by employee or by revenue, of the assessed entity vendor. To your point, they can be very small and still represent significant risk to the business. Yeah. We're saying we certainly have to provide customer success support for those vendors, but our core job is to make sure that relying parties understand the risk if they don't take action and engage in the right assurance frameworks with the right sets of controls. And as this team knows, without being hyperbolic in the least, I'll tell you one anecdote. When I joined the company back in September, I actually joined a board meeting 2 weeks before. I'd actually signed, but I hadn't started, to meet Ryan and other members of the leadership team and Dan, the founder, in Brighton Park's offices in Manhattan, where I'd spent the last 5 years of my life with our headquarters there. And I was sitting there and I'd read a little bit I'd done obviously quite a bit of diligence, had a bunch of conversations, and I bumped into this number in our published, fairly well-known in the market trust report, so-called trust report, that confirmed that HITRUST customers, through that ICP lens, the relying parties, have a 99.6% breach-free rate. And I thought to myself, I actually smiled and said, guys, I get I'm soon to be the new CEO. Great to meet all of you. I just am curious, where did this number come from? Is this a marketing generator number? Or is this, in other words, is this a defensible number? And Dan and the Bimal on the team who runs our assurance program, the SVP of assurance and quality, said, no, that comes out of the product. That's a product specific number. In other words, you can take that number to the bank. Now we could quibble, is it 99.2%? Is it 97 point something percent? Okay, I'm willing to acknowledge, the number itself may not be perfect, but the ability to remediate risk, to get greater assurance via this lens through our very robust set of controls, I think is valuable. And we have a moral responsibility to our organization to see that it gets consumed beyond where it is today. Yeah. Including, by the way, I'll just pretend like our future could take us outside of North America or the United States. It could also take us to some adjacent verticals beyond healthcare, where we have a great brand today, but I think there's some opportunity there. I'm not giving away anything. I'm not making any prophecies here. I just know that the world needs what we do, and we're committed to helping the world become in a high trust framework than it might be today.
Right.
And I'll pause there. I want to make sure. Oh, please go. I was going to give Ryan an opportunity too, but go ahead, Jeff.
Sorry, only one follow-up, and that's the insurance grade proof that you're putting out. Can you talk about insurance at all? Are you looking at risk transfer?
We're actively looking at it. I don't know that I want to say too much yet. It
Okay.
certainly is something. And if you talk to the supplemental insurers or the reinsurers, the brokers of insurance, generally speaking, organizations that can demonstrate they are HITRUST certified receive a premium discount on
Yeah.
supplemental cyber insurance.
Yeah.
Jeff, I think you're anticipating where the market's going to go. I think at the end of the day, unfortunately, very few organizations have gotten good at and have little maturity on the ability to quantify their risk.
Yeah.
It's an unknown unknown. In other words, it's an
It is.
unquantifiable, unknowable risk. And until you have better framework, government frameworks, et cetera, compliance frameworks, I think it's going to be a problem for the foreseeable future. So organizations out there who are, eager to find additional ways to partner with HITRUST are asking the same kinds of questions, Jeff, that you're asking. We see a very interesting path there, probably not as a reinsurer, but
Yeah.
more as someone who can help provide a greater assurance and compliance framework that says when you're HITRUST certified and have that stamp of approval, you can take it to the bank literally and get discounts on things like limits on liability, things like, supplemental insurance, cyber insurance, et cetera.
Business
And then,
interruption insurances. Yeah. BI
absolutely.
is where I'm going. Yes. Thank you.
I've got a great colleague who I've got a lot of respect for and trust in on Ryan on the phone, who you all know and the community knows quite well. Ryan, do you want to take my couple of comments here and maybe go a little bit deeper, including technically deeper than I'm perhaps comfortable on the call today doing?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all.
Hi, Ryan.
I think third-party risk right now is a hot button item. I mean, maybe because my algorithm feeds it to me this way, my LinkedIn feed is full of nothing but TPRM type conversations, covering all the things that we've already covered here: questionnaires, manual inefficiencies, are we actually reducing risk, are we checking boxes, so on and so forth. So like HITRUST is making a very deliberate pivot to help the TPRM community because we feel so confident in the outcomes of achieving HITRUST certification for organizations of varying shapes and sizes that it is beneficial and of value to the organizations that have vendors, whether it be efficiency gains, meaning you can process vendors faster or more vendors in the same amount of time. There could be potential cost reduction because you've got 5 people on staff that are doing TPRM and 5,000 vendors. That math doesn't math, but you don't have to hire more because you can do more by leveraging the work that's been done against HITRUST. And then there's obviously the risk mitigation. In the conversations that I'm having, and the conversations that I'm having really vary. Like Gregory talked that we have our ideal customer profile, but we're having conversations outside of that ideal customer profile, much smaller organizations that may have pockets of vendors. And those three things are what's resonating with the market. And HITRUST is committed to educating, providing resources, coming to the table and being a partner with these organizations, these TPRM teams, in order to solve this problem, because it is a big problem. I think Sue and Donna and Jeff, you've definitely seen this, but in the Verizon data breach report, TPRM related breaches doubled from 24 to 25. And it's only going to continue that way. I have a colleague named Tom Kellerman who loves this term called island hopping. They're using third parties to get through the walls that you've created for your own organization, and they're launching attacks from your third parties. So it's really, taking AI out of the equation, it's really becoming the exploit of preference for malicious actors. And I'm repeating myself now, HITRUST wants to solve this problem.
Well, and that's where I feel like, and Gregory, you might be able to shed more light on this with your background. That's where I feel like the power of the investment community can really drive some fundamental change, because a lot of those organizations that are leveraged as vendors, they can be startups, they're newer organizations, they're offering services that the healthcare community is really clamoring for, and health tech services are clamoring for, because they want to drive efficiency, they want to leverage AI, they want to be better and do more with the resources that they have so that they're using them wisely. And unfortunately, in some cases, it's leading them down a riskier path, which they're working hard to get to. But this is where those questionnaires are falling painfully short. They're not doing anything to actually mitigate risk. And this is where the investment community can and probably has a very vested interest, pun
Yes.
intended, to
Yes.
say, I want to protect my investment. I want to protect this business. I want to, and in order to make sales, because I think that's where this is going to go very quickly, in order to make sales, we're going to have to show how we protect our clients' data.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It's interesting. One of the conversations I had with one of the board members of HITRUST at Brighton Park was effectively this topic. They've got a fairly large and growing portfolio company population, and we actually found out that we have a number of customers who are part of those communities, right? So, basically part of the same family, and we're simply saying, hey, who else can we start to talk to? Because it's in their best business interest as investors to ensure that those portfolio companies understand where potential threats lie, including things like toxic assets. Lots of growth equity companies grow via acquisition. As you acquire another company, a peer company or a smaller company, a startup company, you've got to do a better job of understanding and quantifying what does that risk look like, what does the profile look like, and then taking appropriate action. I think I would just say, certainly the journey we're on with a very interested growth equity company means also that, the difference, I think, in my mind between private equity and growth equity, or private equity in general, venture capital and private and growth equity, is that at our stage of growth, as you know, we've got a great brand. It's generally considered the gold standard of the space that we sit in terms of assurance and certifications. It also means that as we think about our growth journey, and I'm clearly not a technology, I'm not an engineer. I didn't grow up from engineering. I came with a PhD in comparative literature and got into, go-to-market activities. And I think it's time, in terms of our growth journey, including a close collaboration with our founder, to say, we will always do everything required to protect the brand. We're not going to deviate at all from the need to ensure our absolute independence. We're going to always stay neutral. We're going to make sure there's no conflicts of interest. We're going to make sure that annual, soon to be quarterly, if I have my way, trust report is based on data and science, not based on anything that could be easily manipulated. Thus, the maintenance of the brand means we're unbiased. And I think as long as we continue to charter that course, we're thinking our North Star is both tied to growth, because when we're growing, that means the market is better protected generally, especially in the sense, and I'll share this, with caution. Ryan and I and others on the leadership team have spent the last couple of weeks out meeting with our partners, and we have, as you know, we have some incredibly committed partners, both in terms of the assessor community, who we value and obviously want to maintain that important independence and neutrality, but also some of the so-called resellers in the space who also provide value added resellers. And in all cases, I think it's universally understood that some of the, I wouldn't call them competitors, but some of the adjacencies in our space, there's a little bit of a race to the bottom in terms of value, right? Because it is too often checking a box, spending a little bit of money to check a box to claim something without actually improving your assurance posture or your reduction in risk management. That's a topic that I don't claim to be an expert on, but it's something that we're looking at in terms of how do we grow appropriately while maintaining that neutrality, that no conflicts of interest. And to your point, what growth equity does is means that people believe enough in the journey we're on. It's fairly evident from that growth, including thousands of customers who trust our brand and who rely on the solutions we provide, that it's time to turn up the gas a bit and make the appropriate, I'd call it fueling the business a little bit on the go-to-market side, so that we provide more of the coverage while maintaining that brand and the independence. Doing that, of course, will be my opportunity, maybe even my challenge, because growth equity also mandates that you grow in certain ways. And we want to do it professionally, with deep care and concern for our customers, making sure that the solutions we provide do add significant value, including better than what else might be out there on the market in terms of potential competitors.
You mentioned before, earlier in the conversation, those opportunities, as well as the change in landscape, not just for, let's say, a cybersecurity industry, but also a business. So previously we had on-prem things, right? And then everything moved over to the cloud. You had a more dispersed dependency list. I call them strategic dependencies instead of assets. So we saw that change happen in the real world, and I look at it as an opportunity for HITRUST to shift, right? So, for example, there's an opportunity with reporting, right? So, for example, I provide goods and services to my customers, and then my customers provide goods and services back over to us, right? It's a very mutually beneficial situation where the standard reporting for pretty much any vendor on the market. We got ISO 27001 certification, we got SOC 2, whatever it happens to be. I look at that potential shift in reporting to be a differentiator if HITRUST chooses to go that path. So, for example, when I read my HITRUST report, I see a very specific blurb up top. I see some scoped items, and then a very extensive list of controls and statuses, right? So if I ever do give my full report to a potential second party, like a client who's signing a contract with us, they still ask about the questionnaire because there's not much context in that report, right? So I consider that an opportunity. Do you see things differently as far as the opportunities go?
No, I don't. I think you're right. I mean, we're certainly doing some development work, some research and development work on ways to provide better visibility to the relying party customer about what the mapping of a framework might look like across the population of vendors, right? That's something we haven't done in the past. We have a beta capability today that we've named Control Center, which Stephen will do a lot of that capability. It's it's like a lot of the SaaS companies worked at. You have this kind of phone home capability, so the vendor understands how a product is being consumed to make sure you're enforcing appropriate licenses. I don't think that's what we're trying to accomplish. We're actually trying to provide better visibility for our customer, right, the relying party, to understand what their risk profile is, including the sharing of those reports. Now, it won't be perfect, and we're not going to mandate via end user license agreements or contractually that the assessed entity share the report. It has to be a relationship of trust, of course, between those two entities. But we're going to try to make it easier for the relaying party to have the appropriate visibility so they can take action appropriately, including mandating additional, in our case, right, could you so-called upgrade from an E1, which is a very powerful framework with fewer controls than an R2, could you use that mechanism, that mapping mechanism to be able to go to a partner, a vendor and network and say, we think it's time you upgrade to a more robust control framework like an R2. So that is very much happening. Ultimately, when I think about our research and development, it is all going to go through the lens of that particular customer. How do we support that customer's journey to reduce risk through assurance frameworks and more controls or better controls? That's the journey I think we've been on. We're going to lean in on that and make sure we're taking care of that, assuming, of course, that that's where the risk profile is greatest, is the connection between the relying party, let's just assume like a very large healthcare provider, and its in-network vendors, including, by the way, through a thing like an RFP process. Because what we see oftentimes is, you're a, let's just call it a large Fortune 500 or Global 1000, your business is growing, you need to find new vendors who can solve additional problems in the business. So you push out a request for proposal, a request for whatever. You want to make sure that when you onboard those vendors, generally our customers are simply saying, unless you're HITRUST certified, you don't even get to bid. We're not interested in partnering with you unless you're HITRUST certified. So it's actually an interesting driver for us, because through new assessed entity consumers or vendors, they're actually then going down and say, okay, I'll go get HITRUST certified because I want to be able to bid or compete for the bid on this project. I think the world you're just going to see increasing amounts of that, including, to Jeff's point, about supplemental insurance or cyber insurance.
Yeah, I think because to
Great
Jeff's
question.
point, the cyber insurance, I mean, what they usually lead with is questionnaire. So for them to be able to say, oh, you've got high trust, well, somebody else has already done not only a questionnaire, but that validation behind it, the gathering of evidence and all of that. So, and I've actually used that before when somebody has said, hey, have you done an assessment, an external assessment that's looked at all facets? And I'm like, well, I can get partial credit because they have cyber insurance. So somebody's done an assessment that's looked at some of the different domains. But yeah, so I do see that two-way street there with it. It works for the cyber insurance vendor to say, if you're high trust certified, I want to insure you. And I have less work I have to do to get that underwriting and that underwriter to sign off on that preferred rate.
Absolutely. And I'm by the way, I'm no prophet on this topic, but I have a high degree of confidence that at some point in the future, that becomes a driver for us that, we just become increasingly ubiquitous because you want to reduce that rate. And so this is about, proving value versus simply checking a box. And I get the value of both. There's certainly some value in jumping through the hoop that says I'm a minimally viable certified through this framework or this lens organization. But for organizations who are mature and serious about risk and cyber and understanding threats and then mitigating threats, I do think there comes a point in the world where, or a point in the future in time where you just see an increased dependence on even mandate for high trust among potentially others. Although today I might have a slightly biased view on that, where I think a lot of it is generally coming our way as we think about making sure our solution set in the market is robust and rigorous and tested and maintains that independence.
Well, and I'm wondering if part of why there's a reluctance in some cases to adopt or go to a high trust framework is the requirement that things have to be in place and operational for 3 months. I'm working with a startup that they're in the middle of they're about to release their first minimally viable product. And when you said that, I was like, oh yeah, it kind of sparked that question. But they've already gotten a SOC 2 type 1 because they've got the policies in place. They've been doing the creation of this product in a very secure manner. They've got the credentialing and the identity and access management down, but they're not going to be able to they wouldn't be ready for a high trust certification. Say they go January 1, realistically, June is going to be the first time that they're going to actually be able to say they can be high trust certified because of that 3 month, everything operating for that long. So is there kind of like a starter, or thought of doing that to say, I can't validate this, but comparing what you're saying you're going to do and the policies and processes that you have in place, is there a way to kind of mimic a SOC 2 type 1?
I mean, the shortest answer I can give is no, because of our commitment to that, that high trust assurance. That having said that, Susan, there's certainly lots of demand for it. Our partners, every
Okay.
conversation, it's always like, is there a quicker time to value journey
Right.
that is less frictional for the vendor? And I think our answer has universally and likely will continue this way for the future is like, no. Do you want to get assurance or do you want to take a box? You've
Right.
got to pick, because there are alternatives where you could simply, pay a fee, jump through a hoop, and get a check mark. Our view is, that is kind of core to the protection of the brand. Is it making sure that there's a reason there's a 3 months, there's a minimally viable, because we can't. There's no attestation from our side until you meet and jump through, those high hurdles. And because of that, you just continue to maintain the kind of gold standard in the industry for what we do. Though I want to acknowledge, I mean, we certainly have both customers, consumer, subscriber, vendors, and lots of partners saying, hey, there's a barrier here, a barrier to entry. Could you help us overcome it? And we're certainly having lots of strategic conversations as a management team about what that might look like. I don't have anything to reveal or pre-reveal here. I'd say stand by. We're certainly conscious that in some cases the barrier to entry is high or maybe too high. But I would argue, like, if you're really serious about it, and if you're in our target, which is the global 5,000, then you probably need to go back to the drawing board and think more strategically about what problems are you trying to solve? Because if you're serious about solving the particular problems that we solve, I don't think there are shortcuts in this game.
Well, what I typically am doing, if there is, say, an investor that's saying, well, unless I get some sort of an external audit that says you are going to, when this goes live, my data will be in it, in order for me to be that beta tester. What I typically do is advise them to use an environment that already has been HITRUST certified. So, in addition to a cloud vendor, there's cloud providers, like an environment that has that. So it's not just the infrastructure, but it's the platform that's been HITRUST certified. So I'll usually recommend to them and say, hey, if you need this immediately, host your stuff there and then start building out your infrastructure so that you'll at least have almost like a bridge to say, well, I've got it in this secure place while it goes day one, and then by 6 months in, we'll have it in our infrastructure, and then we'll be able to get that HITRUST certified. But that also requires usually a migration, from one platform area to another environment.
Yeah, and we will continue to look to ways to make the journey. I think in general, a couple of things are almost universally true. One is information wants to be free, so you've got an obligation to try to protect it. Two is better, faster, cheaper, with particular emphasis on better and faster usually wins. And so, our view is we always have to be asking ourselves, are we doing the right thing for our customers? I think the sense is yes. And then third, I don't want to get too deep in this topic because I'm not an expert, but the notion of inheritance and ensuring that those capabilities, those controls, and the framework that then governs the ability to be certified also need to be inheritable, perhaps easier. And we're working on things, as you can imagine, where it's no longer a static PDF. It becomes more of a dynamic report that is consumable in lots of ways and places, including potentially your GRC. We're having some good debate on that topic. How do we maintain independence, but also ensure that we're supporting our big customers so that their lives are easier, because that's part of the journey. It's not just about security, cyber, and assurance. It's also about ease of use and the ability to adopt technology that might have some barriers or inhibitors. I don't know that I have all the answers yet. I just know that members of the team at HITRUST are asking those questions on a regular basis, and they prosecute the answers. And generally the response after the diligence is, hey, we can't do that because if we do, we give up something, and we're not willing to do that for our customers.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a matter of educating those first pilot customers to say, look, I can give you access in to see what the controls are doing. I just can't certify it right now, but it's coming. But a lot of times they're reluctant. Well, I don't really want to put my data in there until I have it as that somebody else has looked at it and said it's good. And it's not just,
It's so true. Trust
the person's
me,
telling me the solution.
I will tell you, as someone who's now come from the enterprise B2B, mostly SaaS world, right? Time to value is something you care deeply about and measure, where in previous lives, you would do a proof of concept or proof of value with a SaaS capability. And when the target, the prospect, right, the prospective customer buys, you don't have to do anything. You literally flip a license switch. And the SaaS solution that you had as part of your POC just becomes your live production version. We don't have that luxury, and so we're clearly asking questions of our innovation team, and the founders asked this question a couple of times, like, what does that time to value journey look like, and are there ways we can improve the time to value, if not via SaaS, because that's a clear winner. We do have, my CS is clearly a subscription-based SaaS solution. But I think to get to the eventual full value, like R2 all-in assurance certification, that takes time and effort. And there's probably no way around that in the short term. So candidly, part of my job is to find a way through the effective data sets, messaging, positioning to make sure that the target, like the CISO, the economic buyer or the champion, right, both the sponsor, realize that to go on this journey, there will be some friction. But the result, the benefit, the ROI, the TCO is so high that it's like, why would you not do this? That's kind of the job I've got to do in terms of improving or even transforming our go-to-market, is making sure that we, in many ways, the job of the really good product marketer is to reprogram the mind of the buyer. We got to do a better job of making sure we're doing that as part of our journey, not just because we're trying to grow, but because we think we have a moral imperative and moral obligation to do it so that we make the world a safer place as a result of our efforts.
And how is that journey going to translate into, what your existing customers can expect for the next, year, 2 years? There, so I just for a little bit more context, I am a consultant. I work with a number of different clients, some of whom are on this call, and it would be great to understand a little bit more about what they can expect. Not to get too far down in logistics, but just there's my CSF, there are the different frameworks, and there was the consistent, continuous monitoring that had been slated for Q1. How is that shaping up?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and there's some parts of it that are kind of mutual NDA type conversations that I can't share here, not because I don't want to, but I think we'll find a venue opportunity to do so at some point in the future when they're more. We are confidentially, like, we're actively running some new capabilities in closed betas that I think will be very well received by the market in general and make the lives of all parties, partner assessors, relying parties, in-network, so-called assessed entity vendors. I think it will make their lives easier. It will also make their lives more efficient. If I think about the work we do, I mean, it's like a bus route, and you can get on the bus anywhere you want on your journey to increased assurance and cybersecurity. You could start because the pain today is one of cost or one of reduced complexity, or it's increased or reduced risk through understanding what the risk profile is. I'm okay if you start that journey wherever you want. In the end, we're confident we're going to get to lots of value across all three of those frameworks. In terms of what to expect, yeah, continuous assurance is a really interesting one. We've spent a lot of time on it. We actually have capability that we're currently testing today. What's interesting is, and Donna, I don't want to break any secrets, but I'll be honest, lots of our target customer organizations, they don't want continuous. It represents too much burden when on a daily or regular basis what your risk profile is. They can, in some cases, barely get done when you publish, a HITRUST report that clearly confirms that you have some places where you've got significant risk or vulnerability, that you've got to go look at the controls and figure out, is this a deployment issue of some, third-party software? Is this some other issue or even a physical control issue? And by the way, we should save it, but for a future conversation, talk at length about artificial intelligence, including genetic artificial intelligence, because the risk, the totality of that unmitigated risk or the unknown, unquantifiable risk goes up quite dramatically, I think. And what's interesting is we're having lots of conversations with current customers and future, customer prospects on exactly that topic. So I won't share more than that today. Just note that we're in active, not only conversation on the research side, innovation. A guy you probably know on our team, Jeremy, who runs the innovation labs team, thinks about this all day, and he's got one of these mega processors with his team, including Brian on the team, and they know what the journey is. And one of those is how do we reduce the friction to onboard? How do we improve time to value for a new customer, including a journey to eventual full like R2 certifications, and to do it in a manner that is amenable to all parties, and it isn't such a heavy lift. I would love to see us, by the way, to answer your question short, I'd love to see us get to a point where we issue continuous assurance, but only when the customer is willing to say, yeah, we think there's value in this, and we're willing to sign up for the work. Because right now, as you know, as your community here knows, it's a lot of work. And we want to be conscious of that while also maintaining that absolute, 100% commitment to reducing risk through assurance frameworks that are high value and fully independent and verifiable.
Mm-hmm.
Long answer, sorry.
No,
I'm excited, by the way.
That was great, and it is absolutely appreciated. So, I know that there are a lot of folks looking forward to see what's coming for 2026, and there had been some various rumors that I want to go too far down a path which might not be shaped up for public consumption yet, but there've been some hallway rumors about some pretty significant price increases, and I know that there are some clients who are worried about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We, before I joined the company, without giving too much color on this topic, I think it's an important and it's certainly appropriate one for our community. We've let our assessors know about our plans. We engaged some experts at significant expense before I joined to go do a packaging exercise and understand what does a more modern pricing and packaging relationship look like? And I mean, I mentioned a significant spend because you don't engage in these projects lightly. Certainly, as part of the diligence process, and without giving specifics, the number of interested investor communities in the growth private equity space was significant. I mean, Dan, the founder, spent a lot of time. The team spent literally hundreds of hours across hundreds of meetings in a diligence process, and universally, the response from that community was, "You guys are underpriced. The value contribution you provide to the market relative to price is too low. You've got to go look at this." And the organization, without revealing the name, that we eventually engaged before I joined, this initiative is, kicked off before I joined, but I fully embrace it and I'm very supportive of it. And we're actually seeing really good outcomes, including with our customers. They actually did the diligence work on the sell side for a couple of the other competitive bidders in the private equity space. And they said to me in my first steering committee meeting, they said, we have about 100 years between the four partners who've done only pricing and packaging initiatives. We've never seen a clear opportunity that you could fully justify for the kind of price increase that we're recommending. The reason I'm conscious of what this does is because I think, and I've talked to a lot of our assessor partners, is I think we have to change the dynamic in terms of what really good market share and wallet share look like as a shared community of partners. Because what I've heard from some very large, very strategic assessor firms is, hey, usually the wallet share is confined, and if you're taking more of the available dollars to spend, that means we're probably getting less. And I've simply said that can't be acceptable.
Right.
So we have to do a better job of expanding the mind share, including of what the total total cost of ownership is. And I think we've begun to do that. I'd love for members on this call who've got concerns or who have a different perspective to reach out. Gregory.Webb, 2Bs, at HITRUSTalliance.net. I'm not afraid. I'm not shy. Please share feedback. It's a community. We're all in together. We all care deeply about the spaces we're in, and we're not going to get it perfect. But we're already seeing enough 2 months into this to know that it is universally, with almost no exception, been, while there's been conversations and some commercial negotiations for sure, which is part of the job, and maybe some objection handling, I think universally the customer community have said, yeah, we don't have a choice. We're all in, and if it means we got to pay a little bit more, and remember, the cost per assessed entity vendor is relatively low compared to value, especially when I look at SaaS companies I've worked at, where ASP, average sales price, is generally much higher.
I think the challenge that I have heard from various folks that I've spoken with is because it is healthcare focused, right? So healthcare organizations, when you're talking about the core entities and hospitals and healthcare orgs, they are trying to balance budgets very carefully because it's a very short step into what does the patient pay in terms of the services for their, to come to their facility, or what's getting charged through to the insurance companies, which of course gets then fed back to the consumer. The SaaS companies in the health tech space are slightly more removed, but still subject to that sector and the knock-on environment. And this is where that third-party positioning and our ability to significantly address the administrative burden that gets sucked out by the questionnaires and everything else, and the risk that perpetuates, could be an advantage as HITRUST is looking at, well, how do we actually price according to value rather than according to, sector parameters? And I think part of that could be in addressing because there's a ridiculous amount of money being spent on third-party risk management in the form of questionnaires and things that don't work, that don't actually minimize risk or address it in any way. And if we can, I've actually sent Ryan a business case on this. I've been on this bandwagon for years. But if that's something that we could leverage and spin a bit in order to position HITRUST better for that, it could benefit the pricing strategy and the industry without hitting on a pinch point that's just driving a really uncomfortable position.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I would certainly value the opportunity to do a one-off with you and others in your network, Donna, who could give me perspective on this. I think, we are certainly, we want to be good partners. We want to maintain the reputation that we've worked for 17 years. I would argue that Dan Nuck, as the founder, built the assurance marketplace that we're in today. Obviously, it's a much bigger marketplace than it was then. But we're conscious in terms of our, we're conscious that we ultimately report to a fully not-for-profit HITRUST advisory board, our board of directors, and they're asking the same kinds of questions. What does this do, et cetera, et cetera. On the slightly more commercial side, which is part of my responsibility in terms of taking the support of our new investor partners. How do you do this in a meaningful way that doesn't disrupt things, certainly that doesn't put an undue burden on an already stretched and frankly slightly financially stressed healthcare industry? And so what we've done is effectively said, look, we believe the price increase is warranted. We believe it's fully justified. This is not about a give to get nothing. We believe there's tremendous value, but we're also conscious of annual budget processes, which means in general, we've said where appropriate, look, if this needs to be a multi-year thing and some of the pricing isn't fully realized or doesn't affect you or hit you upfront in year one, it might get shared over a couple of years. We've done that a couple of cases in terms of commercial negotiations. And again, like universally, we're not seeing, I mean, we anticipated some level of churn. That's just part of the game we're in. Customers can sometimes find greener pastures, and maybe it's a perception or believe they've got a better opportunity somewhere else. We're actually performing against this campaign better than the analysis sort of suggested. So we're confident that the thing we've done is the right thing to do, and that it does, by the way, fuel additional investments both into product, into research, and into things like government affairs, where we're spending a lot of money to make sure we're having conversations with people who can control outcomes and who can mandate both at the state and federal government things that ultimately benefit the community and do reduce the risk and help them better quantify what that exposure might look like. So we think as we increase slightly those prices, and it's not universal, by the way, it's some will go up, some actually go down slightly based on the modernized package and pricing. Our commitment to the community, to the market, is that we're going to go spend those very judiciously and make sure we're investing them in places that ultimately benefit the community. That's the commit. I hope that helps, by the way. That's like, I couldn't be more transparent than that.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Of course.
Perfect. Well, and we're wrapping up to the top of the hour, and I definitely want to be cognizant of your time. So are there any final thoughts, any kind of things that we forgot to ask you, or things that you just wanted us to know as a HITRUST community?
No. I mean, look, I've always got more to say. Isn't that the job of any good leader? I think I would say, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. It's been lovely to be together, especially as we go into the holidays. I hope everyone who is either on the call or listens to this eventually via on demand has a wonderful, safe holiday. There's nothing like spending time with the people we all work very hard to be with together. That matters to us. And so please go do that. Be safe. Two, I just acknowledge that, I'm really excited about where we are and what we're doing and where we're going. And I couldn't ask for a better community. I think this is a really diligent, committed community. The work you guys do is invaluable. I'm looking to, lastly, just acknowledge that I want to deepen our relationships with our partners across all types. I think in the past, we've been a little bit hands-off in order to maintain that independence. We want to do things that, of course, in terms of, partner programs or tiers of partners, make it available to anybody, but clearly there will be some additional value to those who are already doing the work that's required. We want to make sure we're taking good care of those partners. And lastly, I really look forward to meeting more of you in person, including people I can't see, but I know are on the call or will eventually listen, and deepening the partnership in ways that are meaningful in terms of providing additional high trust. And I literally mean that HIGH, higher levels of trust than we might have as a world population community today. Super grateful to be here, guys.
Thank you so much. We very much
Thank
enjoyed
you.
having you.
My pleasure. Safe
Thank
holidays.
you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Holidays.
Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. If you got value from this episode, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next HITRUST Secrets. We go live every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central and dig into real-world compliance and security topics. And each session gets uploaded right here after the live show. So whether you're catching us live or on your own time, make sure you're subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your HITRUST journey.